They called her too wild for any man to keep, not stubborn feral, the kind of girl who didn't flinch when slapped, didn't beg when threatened, didn't cry when humiliated. Folks in Dry Creek had seen a lot, but no one forgot the day Clara walked into the saloon, blood at her lip and rage in her spine, bound at the wrist like livestock. The man who dragged her in reeked of liquor and pride, shouting for attention. $1, he barked, for the woman who thinks she don't need no man. Laughter erupted. A few leaned in, curious. Most didn't care. But Clara didn't lower her eyes, didn't shift in shame. She just stood there, dirt clinging to her boots, hair tangled, fists clenched. Her lip was split, her shirt torn at the collar, and still she looked like fire that refused to be put out. No one moved. No one bid, until a quiet voice from the back of the room said, $2. The laughter stopped. All eyes turned. A man in a worn duster, boot brace visible under his pant leg, leaned against the frame of the doorway. His name was Silas Walker. People knew him as the rancher with the limp and the too small spread. He wasn't feared. He wasn't envied. He was mostly ignored. Clara turned slightly, eyes locking with his unreadable. The drunk cursed but took the coin anyway, tossing it into the till and staggering off to refill his glass. Clara didn't say thank you. She didn't speak at all, but she followed when Silas turned and walked out into the fading daylight. He didn't touch her, didn't ask her to ride with him, just handed her the reins to the pack mule and started walking the dirt path west. They reached his land just after sundown, a modest stretch near the edge of the basin with tired fencing, 3 milk cows, and a one-room shack that had seen better years. Clara looked around without comment, then dropped her bag by the door and rolled up her sleeves. She didn't ask what was expected. She hauled water, fed chickens, chopped firewood. Silas let her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer compliments either. But every morning, when he brewed the coffee, there were always 2 cups. The town whispered, called her his stray. Some joked she was more wolf than woman, but Clara worked harder than any hired man Silas had ever known. She patched the barn roof, fixed a leak in the water line, carved a trough from old timber. Silas noticed. Of course, but not once did he praise her. Instead, he worked beside her, shoulder to shoulder, quiet, steady. On the 3rd week, she caught her hand on barbed wire and winced. Silas wordlessly handed her a cloth and a jar of salve. That night, by lantern light, she cleaned the wound herself, but he sat nearby, whittling a spoon from cedar, saying nothing, just being there. One evening, after a long day fencing pasture, Clara stood outside, eyes scanning the fields as dusk settled. She held her elbows, lost in thought. Silas stepped onto the porch. "Supper's on," he said. She didn't move. "My parents died when I was 8, she said finally, voice low. Home was fire and blood and then gone. Since then, I've been passed around more than cattle." Silas didn't respond. She turned. "I don't need saving. Never did." He nodded. "Good," he said simply, and went inside. She followed a moment later. Weeks turned to months. The ranch didn't grow, but it held steady. The cows calved. The crops took. Clara planted wildflowers near the fence line, tiny bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush. Silas noticed but didn't mention them. A week later, he left a small sack on the table. Inside were seeds wrapped in wax paper and a note, "My ma's favorite." Clara didn't smile, but she held the note long after the lamp burned out. Trouble came, like it always does. A banker from Junction wrote in, claiming unpaid debts from Silas's father. Talked smooth, waved papers, tried to confuse him into signing over the land. Clara saw through it. She took one look at the contracts and said, "This is a trap." Silas didn't argue. He let her speak, watched as she dismantled the lies with calm precision. The banker left with nothing but dust on his coat. That night, as the fire crackled and Clara scribbled numbers in the ledger, Silas poured 2 cups of coffee, added a splash of molasses the way she liked, and set one by her elbow. "You've got a good head," he said. She didn't answer, but her hand paused on the page. Then she said quietly, "You can call me Claire. Just Claire." He nodded, as if it had always been her name. The next morning, she was gone. No note, no sound. Just an empty chair and the smell of yesterday's cornbread. Silas stood at the edge of the barn, watching the sun rise, jaw tight. Then he saddled up, rode east, followed the trail until he saw her pack slung over her shoulder, walking toward nowhere. He dismounted, stood still. She didn't turn. "You leaving for good?" he asked. "I was never meant to stay," she replied. "Didn't figure you'd mind." "I do," he said. "You're not work here. You're part of it." Claire finally turned, eyes softer than before. "And what if I don't want to be owned?" "You're not," he said. "But you're welcome. That's different." She didn't cry, didn't smile either. But she walked back beside him, not behind. By summer, the land bloomed brighter. Townsfolk started calling it Wildflower Ridge. Not because of the flowers, but because of the girl who planted them. And the man who let her grow. Silas Walker didn't walk like most men. His right leg dragged just slightly, a reminder of the accident no one in Dry Creek ever dared ask him about. But he stood tall in every other way that counted. He spoke with the calm of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. And when he looked at you, it was as if he saw the truth before you could say it. The day he stepped into that smoke-choked saloon and offered $2 for Clara, no one could read his face, not pity, not desire, just a quiet certainty that stopped the laughter cold. He didn't touch her. He didn't pull her by the arm. He simply looked at her and gave a small nod, like asking, not ordering. Clara watched him a long second before following. It wasn't submission, it was choice. Out on the trail, he rode ahead but not far. His pack mule carried supplies. He carried nothing but a bedroll and the weight of his own silence. Clara didn't try to speak, and Silas didn't fill the air with useless words. When they reached his land, a modest spread tucked beside a shallow creek and framed by cottonwoods, he offered her water, a place by the fire, and space. She took all three in silence, her eyes always scanning the edges of the trees like something might come for her. Silas noticed but said nothing. That night, he slept inside. She chose the barn loft, curled into a pile of hay, hand still curled around the knife hidden in her boot. The next morning, she rose before the sun and fetched water from the creek without being asked. She split logs and fed the chickens. Silas watched from the porch, one hand cradling his coffee, the other resting on his bad knee. When she caught him watching, she didn't stop, just worked harder, like she was proving something. That afternoon, she fixed a broken fence rail, her fingers blistering, knuckles bloodied. When Silas passed by, he didn't offer to take over. He just handed her a cloth and said, "There's salve in the pantry." No instruction, no praise, just acknowledgement. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm, not of words, but of movement. Silas mended the porch. Clara mucked stalls. He brought in feed. She laid fresh straw. They didn't share meals at first. She'd eat outside or standing near the fire. But on the seventh day, as thunder rolled in the distance, she came in soaked from the field, and Silas handed her a towel. She dried off, sat across from him, and dipped her spoon into the stew already cooling in her bowl. He didn't smile, neither did she. But something shifted then. A kind of truce. Clara didn't speak much, but Silas never made her feel like she had to. When he did speak, it was with intention short, simple and steady. One evening, while mending tack in the barn, he said without looking up, "Don't let what they called you settle in your bones. Wild just means they couldn't understand you." Clara didn't respond, but her hands stilled for a moment. Then she continued stitching. He never treated her like a possession, never claimed her with touch or name. When he introduced her to the feed supplier who rode through once a month, he simply said, "This is Clara. She's helping with the ranch, not my girl, not the one I brought in, just Clara." It mattered more than he knew. The town didn't understand. They whispered, of course, assumed things, But Clara kept her head down and her hands busy, and Silas let them talk. One night, she found him on the back porch staring out at the stars. She stood beside him, arms crossed against the chill. "Why'd you do it?" she asked. "By me?" He didn't turn, just answered quietly. "Because no one else saw the fire in you, just the danger. I saw what they missed." She studied his face for a long time. Not soft, not handsome, but solid. A man who didn't flinch when she looked too long. "I'm not easy to keep," she said. "Good." He said, "I'm not looking to keep anything. Just give it space to grow." After that, something softened between them. Not romance. Not yet. But trust. He began leaving the ledger open on the table, letting her see the books. She never asked. Just started making notes in the margins, fixing numbers, suggesting better hay vendors. He nodded in approval, and that was enough. He never asked about her past. She offered fragments anyway. Her parents were killed in a land dispute. She'd run from 3 homes and fought her way through 5 towns. Silas listened without blinking. When she finished, he simply said, "You're still here." She looked at him sharply, then nodded once. It was in the quiet moments that she felt it most, his way of seeing her not as broken, but as someone whole in her own way. When her hands shook from cold, he set mittens by the fire. When her shoulders ached, he fixed the saddle height without comment. When she planted marigolds near the porch, he built a small fence to protect them from the chickens. No grand gestures, just daily proof that he respected her enough to notice. The days lengthened. She no longer slept in the barn. The spare cot inside was hers now. He still never touched her without invitation, never called her by anything but her name. But when she handed him the ledgers one night and said, "We could probably turn a better profit if we leased that south field," he looked up and said, "We." "Huh?" She didn't smile. Not exactly. But the corners of her mouth softened. That was the night she left her boots by the front door. And still, Silas asked for nothing, demanded nothing. He only made room for her voice, her fire, her future. And Clara, who had once spat at the idea of belonging to any man, began to believe in something else entirely. Not being owned, being chosen. Clara didn't ask where the broom was. She found it. She didn't ask whose job it was to patch the barn roof or untangle the chicken wire. She just climbed the ladder or knelt in the dirt and did what needed doing. At first light, she rose and hauled buckets to the trough. By sundown, she was tightening fence wire or stacking chopped wood near the porch. Silas watched her from a distance, never instructing, never correcting. When she caught him watching, he didn't look away or pretend he wasn't. He just met her eyes, nodded once, then returned to whatever task he had at hand. There was something respectful in that, how he allowed her presence without expecting it to shrink. She never asked what belonged to her or what didn't. The land, the barn, the meals, she moved through it all like someone used to being temporary, but unwilling to be invisible. She fixed what was broken, repurposed what was rotting. One day, she found a rusted hinge behind the tool shed, soaked it in vinegar, then hammered it straight until it turned again. She mounted it on the barn side door, tested it twice, then moved on without a word. When Silas found it swinging clean and quiet, he didn't ask who'd done it. He just stood there for a moment longer than usual. They didn't speak much, not in the way others might. No small talk, no needling or banter, but when they passed each other with buckets in hand, their shoulders brushed and neither flinched. In the quiet of the evenings, Clara would sometimes sit on the porch step, sharpening tools while Silas finished a row of stitching on a worn saddle strap. There was no need to narrate their thoughts. The work spoke for them. And in that silence, something deeper settled in trust, the kind not demanded but earned. One day, a wheel on the supply cart snapped a spoke out near the south pasture. Clara didn't call out. She didn't wait. She dug into the crate, pulled out a length of rope and a hatchet, and began carving a temporary brace from a fallen limb. Silas arrived an hour later with a replacement wheel, only to find the cart upright and Clara brushing the dirt from her hands. "Would have carried it back if I had to," she said, eyes narrowing like she expected disapproval. Silas only nodded. "Looks like you didn't have to." She built a coop without being asked, taking scrap wood from behind the barn and shaping it with care. When it was finished, Silas stood beside her and ran his hand along the smoothed edge. "Sturdy," he said. Clara shrugged. Foxes don't wait for weak nails. That night, he added an extra blanket to her cot, saying nothing. She noticed, but left it folded at the foot until the frost came. Their connection didn't arrive like thunder or sweep through like prairie fire. It came in pieces small, durable, undeniable. It showed up in the way Silas always left one biscuit in the pan and how Clara always folded his shirt if she found it hung wet by the fire. They didn't call it care. They didn't need to. It was something in the way they filled each other's absence before the other even noticed it was missing. One morning, Clara found an old trap under the porch, jagged, rusted, teeth still sharp. She set it out back where Silas would see it, and later that evening, it was gone, buried, likely, not a word exchanged. Just a quiet understanding that some things didn't belong near the house anymore. When the creek flooded in the spring, Clara waded waist-deep to haul the chickens to higher ground. Silas met her halfway, boots soaked, jaw set, and took half the load without complaint. Afterward, they sat on overturned buckets, soaked to the skin, and drank lukewarm coffee from enamel mugs. No laughter, no comfort words. Just the warmth of being not alone. Sometimes she'd wake from nightmares, silent ones that left her breathing hard and eyes darting. Once, Silas found her outside, leaning against the porch post in the moonlight, arms folded tight. He didn't ask what chased her. He just handed her a canteen and sat on the stairs nearby, staring at the same sky until her shoulders loosened. She didn't thank him. But she stayed outside longer than she meant to. What grew between them wasn't love, at least not at first. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't poetic, but it was steady. It was safe. A space neither of them had known much of. Silas started letting her sign the supply orders, trusting her judgment. Clara took to rearranging the pantry shelves, labeling the jars by use instead of alphabet. He said nothing. But when he reached for the flour and found it in its new spot, he didn't grumble either. Once, a traveler passed through asking for directions and raised an eyebrow at Clara in work clothes. Dirt streaked on her cheek. "She helps out," he asked Silas. Silas just replied, "She runs the place with me." That night, Clara fixed a loose board on the porch and whistled a tune no one had heard from her before. It wasn't romance that drew them together, it was the way neither asked the other to be anything less than what they already were. It was Clara stepping into space and Silas not moving away. It was hands blistered from shared labor, evenings spent in silence that spoke volumes, and the knowing that what they built didn't need to be named to be real. In a world that had taken too much from both of them, what remained was a kind of quiet partnership, forged not by vows or grand gestures but by work, trust, and the kind of respect that grows when no one's trying to own the other. Just build something that holds. Clara never spoke of her past in the early days, and Silas never asked. Not because he wasn't curious, but because he understood the weight silence could carry. She carried herself like someone always ready to leave, shoulders slightly forward as if bracing for a shove that never came. But she stayed, day after day. She worked alongside him, never shirking, never complaining, always one breath away from running. Then one cold night, after a long stretch of fixing fence posts and hauling sacks of feed, they sat outside by the fire pit, a pot of coffee simmering between them, neither reaching for it. The stars stretched wide and speechless above them, and the creek gurgled low in the dark. Clara's voice broke that stillness like a twig snapping. "They were murdered," she said, eyes fixed on the flames. "My parents." She didn't look at Silas, and she didn't need to. He didn't speak, didn't move, just listened. "I was 8. She continued, her tone flat. They ran a little trading post near the Colorado border. Bandits came through, took the safe, shot my father in the chest and slit my mother's throat while I hid under the floorboards. I didn't cry. Not once. Not even after. Her hands were still resting in her lap, but her fingers twisted slowly around themselves, skin pale from pressure. After they left, I walked 15 miles barefoot to the next town. No one asked where I came from. No one wanted a child with blood on her dress and dirt in her teeth. The fire crackled. A coyote howled in the distance. Clara didn't blink. They sent me to a church orphanage in Santa Fe. Rules were sharp as cane switches. I learned to fight before I learned to pray. They said I was unruly, dangerous. One nun called me God's mistake with a knife in her smile. She laughed without humor. I broke that woman's jaw when she tried to lock me in the cellar for 3 days. Silas shifted slightly. The first movement he'd made since she began. Not an alarm, just enough to poke at the fire, sending a soft cloud of sparks upward. I don't regret it, Clara said, glancing sideways at him. I don't regret most things I did to stay alive. He nodded, just once, slow and sure. And she looked down again. After that, they passed me around. Families, work camps, even a saloon once. Nobody wanted to keep me, just use me till I got too loud or too proud. Then it was back to the street, or worse. Her voice had thinned now, like wind slipping under a cracked door. Eventually I stopped expecting warmth, stopped wanting it. Figured if I could outrun softness, it wouldn't have the chance to betray me. She rubbed her palm across her knee, catching a sliver of moonlight on her skin. But it's exhausting. You know, always carrying your own weight, watching your back, expecting every kind act to have a hook in it. Silas added a log to the fire, slowly, as if afraid too much noise might shatter the moment. Still, he said nothing. That, more than anything, made her keep going. When you bought me, she said quietly, I expected you to use me, or pity me, or try to fix me. She looked at him then, really looked, but you just handed me the reins and walked. You left me alone in peace, not in punishment. That messed with my head more than any cell ever did. Silas stared into the fire, jaw tight. Then finally he said, I don't believe in fixing people. We're not clocks. She let out a breath. It wasn't quite relief, but it was close. I don't know what to do with someone who doesn't need anything from me, she admitted. I've only ever been wanted for what I could give. Not who I was. Silas looked at her then, his eyes soft but steady. You're not here because I need something from you. You're here because you stayed. Clara held his gaze for a heartbeat. Then two. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She looked away first, returning her attention to the fire. You're dangerous, Walker, she said, her voice almost playful. You make it real hard to keep hating the world. He smirked faintly, leaning back against the porch post. I don't need you to love it. Just maybe stop trying to burn it down. They sat like that for a while longer, the air cool and still. Clara's shoulders had dropped just enough to soften her shape, as though she had unbuckled some invisible armor. The moon had climbed higher, painting silver across the prairie, and neither one of them reached for the coffee. They didn't need it anymore. Later that week, Silas found her in the tack room oiling an old saddle, humming low under her breath. She didn't startle when he came in. She didn't stop humming, and when he reached up to place a tool on the shelf above her, their hands brushed. She didn't pull away. The days that followed held more of those moments, fewer walls, longer glances. He noticed she started leaving her boots closer to the front door. She noticed he'd built a shelf in the barn where she kept her tools. It was never spoken aloud, but each gesture echoed a deeper truth that vulnerability shared in quiet was more sacred than any promise made in words. Clara still worked hard, still rode like she had something to prove, but she smiled more, even if only to herself. And some nights, when the wind blew through the cottonwoods just right, she'd sit beside Silas again, watching the fire, not because she needed to, but because it felt right. And though neither one ever said it, both of them knew that something had healed not all the way. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to stay. Enough to build something real on the ashes of everything they'd survived. Clara had never planted anything in her life. Everything before Silas's ranch had been about survival, bare-knuckled, teeth-gritted, keep-moving survival. You didn't plant flowers when you didn't know if you'd still be on the same patch of earth next week. You didn't care about beauty when your hands were too busy defending your body or scrubbing blood from your memories. But that spring, something shifted. It started small. A patch of earth by the porch had gone soft with rain, and as Clara passed it one morning, she paused. The dirt was rich, dark, giving. She knelt down without thinking, pushing her fingers into it, breaking the surface, crumbling it between her palms. That night, she couldn't sleep. 2 days later, she rode into town for flour and came back with a small envelope wrapped in butcher paper wildflower seeds. She didn't tell Silas. She just rose early the next morning, grabbed a hoe from the shed and started tilling. The soil gave easily under her hands, like it had been waiting. She planted the seeds in quiet rows, not symmetrical, not perfect, but deliberate. She tamped them gently, covered them, watered them, and walked away. Didn't speak of it, didn't check them the next day either. But she did glance from the window when she thought no one noticed. Silas noticed. He didn't mention the patch of earth beside the porch, nor the way Clara looked at it when she thought she was alone. But a week later, he came in from the barn carrying a tin wrapped in linen. He set it on the table and slid it toward her. Clara looked at it, then at him, wary as always. "What's this?" she asked. "My mother's seeds," he said. She saved them every spring. Wild columbine, mostly. A few others. Clara unwrapped the tin slowly, careful not to spill. Inside were small brown pods, fragile but full of life. She used to say flowers were the only proof she needed that things could grow back after dying. Clara didn't say thank you. She just stood up, took the tin, and walked outside. That evening, after the dishes were done and the animals fed, she returned to the porch with the tin under her arm. She dug a new patch next to the first, hands dirty, nails chipped, sweat streaking her temples. She worked until dusk. Silas didn't join her. He watched from the barn, arms crossed, saying nothing. But when she came in after sunset, tired and flushed, there were 2 mugs of coffee waiting. One had honey stirred in, just the way she liked. Over the next weeks, Clara began tending the flowers daily. She'd kneel in the dirt at first light, checking the soil, pulling weeds. The first green shoots arrived one chilly morning in April, delicate and stubborn. She crouched beside them for a long while, not touching, just watching. That evening, she baked cornbread. Silas didn't say a word, but he ate 3 slices and left the pan clean. Something changed after that. Clara moved her few belongings from the loft of the barn into the house without announcing it. A folded shirt here, a book there. Her spare boots by the back door. Silas never questioned it. He simply built another shelf by the window, lower than the rest, just right for her things. Clara didn't fully understand the ache she felt watching those flowers grow. It wasn't joy, not exactly. More like a soft breaking inside her. The slow unraveling of years lived too hard, too fast, with no place to stop. She found herself humming sometimes while sweeping the porch or brushing down the mare. She laughed once sharply. Unexpectedly, when a rooster chased her through the coop, Silas, passing by with an armful of feed, looked up, startled. Clara froze, mid-laugh, as if unsure what sound had just come out of her mouth. "You should do that more," he said. "Trip over chickens," she replied, wiping her eyes. "Laugh," he said. She didn't answer. But later that night, she left a note by the stove. "We're out of molasses. You want sweet cornbread tomorrow, you better fetch some." It was the first time she'd ever used wheat. The flowers bloomed by May, vibrant reds, soft blues, purples that caught the light at sunset and held it. Clara stood among them one afternoon, hands on her hips. Eyes narrowed with something like pride. Silas stepped out of the barn and leaned against the post, watching her. She turned, caught his gaze, and for once, didn't look away. "You planted something," he said quietly. "I did. You planning to stay long enough to see them bloom again next year?" Clara paused, the question lingering between them like smoke. "I might," she said, voice steady. "If the weeds don't take over?" He smiled, a rare thing, slow and genuine. "We'll keep them back." She nodded, then added, "You better not let the hens scratch them up. I'll build a fence." The next morning, a small wooden fence appeared around the flower bed. Clara didn't ask for it. Silas didn't mention building it. But when she saw it, she stood still a long time, then leaned down and adjusted a crooked stake. That evening, she made stew thick enough to feed a crew, though it was only the two of them. She didn't call it home, not out loud, but she began mending curtains, oiling the door hinges, and straightening pictures that had hung crooked for years. She sat on the porch with Silas in the evenings, her boots untied, ankles crossed, a mug of warm cider in her hands. And when he spoke, she listened. And when she spoke, he listened even more. It wasn't sudden. This shift from survival to belonging, it was a slow layering of days, quiet meals, shared work, and blooms where nothing had grown before. And though she still kept a knife under her pillow, Clara began to sleep through the night, not because the world was safe, but because this place, with its flowers and fences and one quiet man, had finally made room for her. One hot afternoon near the end of June, a polished buggy rolled up the dusty road to the ranch. The horse was too clean, the wheels too well oiled, and the man who stepped down wore city shoes that had never seen cow dung. Clara stood on the porch, arms crossed, hat low, watching him with the kind of stillness she reserved for snakes. Silas stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, nodding once in acknowledgement. The man introduced himself as Martin Bellamy, a representative from a regional investment bank in Abilene. Said he'd come to discuss a financial opportunity concerning the land. Said he'd noticed the tax records and something about arrears and signatures and the possibility of liens. His voice was smooth and his hands too soft. Silas listened, polite but guarded. Clara didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She'd heard men like that before, men who used words the way pickpockets use distraction, smiling while reaching for your pocket. Bellamy pulled out papers from a leather folder, already marked with red tabs and folded corners. He gestured toward numbers and percentages, offered to walk Silas through an easy process to relieve the burden of ownership, promising something about reverse holdings and future payout structures. Clara stepped closer, her arms still crossed but her eyes locked on the documents. Bellamy barely glanced at her. Just a ranch hand, he probably assumed. Silas, for his part, looked uncertain. He wasn't a man who liked paperwork, and Clara knew he carried old debts from years past when drought had nearly ruined the herd. Bellamy must have known that too, or guessed. He pressed harder, saying things like, "Just sign here to keep the ranch secure," using that too smooth tone that always followed someone getting tricked out of something they didn't know how to fight for. Clara stepped forward then, lifting one of the documents from the stack. "Mind if I look?" she asked, not waiting for permission. She walked to the porch rail, set the paper down, and scanned it. Her eyes moved fast, sharp. She flipped a page, then another. "This clause here," she said, pointing, "means he forfeits rights to the mineral content on the property. And this one lets your bank lease grazing rights without consent." Bellamy smiled, but it was thinner now. "Standard legal protections," he said. Clara didn't blink. "Standard for who?" She turned another page. "And this clause here, intent to secure future equity redistribution. That's just pretty language for foreclosure under disguise." Silas looked from her to the banker, then back. "That right?" he asked quietly. Bellamy's face stiffened. "I assure you, everything here is perfectly legal." "Sure it is," Clara said, folding the paper and handing it back. "So was the auction where someone sold me for $2. Bellamy shifted uncomfortably. "I think we're done here," Clara said. her voice firm. Silas didn't argue. He stepped back, shoulders squared. "You can leave now," he added. And for once, there was steel in his voice. Bellamy hesitated, then gathered his papers and climbed into his buggy without another word. Clara watched until the wheels disappeared behind the bend, then finally exhaled. Silas stood next to her, quiet for a long moment. "You just saved this ranch," he said. Clara shrugged, but her eyes were tired. "I just read the fine print. That's what no one ever does." He nodded slowly. "I didn't even see it coming." She turned to look at him then. "Really look." "You weren't supposed to," she said. "That's why people like him come out here. They think folks like you don't know enough to stop them." Silas nodded again. "Good thing I've got you." Clara didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. That night, they sat at the table going through old paperwork, tax receipts, deed copies, dusty ledgers with smudged ink. Clara read every line while Silas ran numbers in his head. It was the first time he'd let someone see that part of the ranch. The real part where survival depended not on muscle but on attention. When she reached a line on the property boundary and raised an eyebrow, Silas chuckled. "Yeah, turns out the fence has been 5 feet off since '74. She smirked, marking it down. "We'll fix that too." From then on, things shifted between them. Silas didn't just respect her labor, he started leaning on her judgment. When he considered a new supplier, he asked her opinion. When he wanted to rotate the herd differently, they mapped it together. One afternoon, he found her in the barn with a legal pad, sketching out an expense report. "We're leaking money in salt blocks," she said without looking up. He grinned. "Guess I better stop letting the cows write the checks." She didn't smile often, but she did that time. It wasn't just that she was smart. It was how she used it quietly, effectively, without lording it over him. And Silas, who had long believed he had to carry the burden of everything alone, realized he didn't have to anymore. Clara wasn't just strong, she was necessary. Not in a way that made her useful, in a way that made her part of the foundation itself. He started sleeping easier. She started cooking more. He built her a small desk in the corner of the front room, near the window where the light was best. She didn't say thank you, just started using it. And when the flowers outside the porch bloomed fully, Clara picked the first few and placed them in a glass jar on the desk beside her ledger. The ranch didn't grow overnight. The rains still came late. The prices were still rough. But there was a steadiness now that hadn't existed before. A rhythm of two minds working toward the same quiet goal. Keep the land, keep each other, and never let a smiling man in a fine buggy fool them again. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long golden shadows across the wooden floor. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows in gentle sighs, but inside, it was warm, still, and filled with the quiet rhythm of pencil scratching against paper. Clara sat at the table, sleeves rolled up, her brow furrowed as she tallied figures from the ranch ledger. Across from her, Silas thumbed through a worn receipt book, cross-checking numbers in his steady, deliberate way. They didn't speak much as they worked, but the silence between them had grown comfortable, like a well-worn path two people knew by heart. It had started as necessity. The ranch books were a mess of faded ink and inconsistent notes when she first got her hands on them. Silas had always managed with mental math and rough estimates, but Clara brought order columns, dates, annotations. She made sense of things. And though Silas never said it outright, he began letting her handle more and more of the financials. He'd watch her work, and occasionally he'd ask questions not to test her, but because he genuinely wanted to understand how she saw things. Night was different, though. There was a kind of stillness between them that felt heavier somehow. Fuller. Maybe it was the way her hand lingered a second longer on the page when their fingers brushed. Maybe it was the way he'd poured her coffee just right, 2 spoons of sugar, a splash of cream, without needing to be asked. Clara reached the end of a page, tapped the pencil against her lip, then glanced up at him. "If we rotate the south pasture sooner than planned, she said. We might be able to stretch the grazing window, save some on feed. Silas looked up, studied her face, not just the calculation behind her words, but the calm confidence she spoke with. He set down the receipt book and leaned back slightly in his chair. You always see what I miss, he said, voice low. Every time. Clara tilted her head, unsure if it was praise or just an observation. I just know what it's like to have to account for every scrap, she replied. When you grow up watching pennies, you learn fast where things go wrong. He nodded, eyes still on her. Then after a pause, he said, Tess, you've done more for this place than I ever could have asked. She froze. The name hung in the air like a thread of smoke. Tess, not Clara, not girl. Tess. Her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever shortened her name like that before. No one had ever spoken it with such softness, as though it belonged to her and her alone. She looked at him, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, unsure how to respond. I didn't mean to assume, he said quickly, a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. If that's not what you want to be called. No, she interrupted, her voice barely more than a whisper. It's okay. I like it. He nodded again, slower this time, and there was a silence between them that pulsed with something warm and unfamiliar. She dropped her gaze back to the ledger, but her hand trembled just slightly as she turned the page. They didn't speak for a while after that, but the silence was different now. It wasn't just comfortable, it was intimate. It held the weight of something that couldn't be rushed, something that was slowly, cautiously being built between them. When she finally pushed the ledger away and leaned back in her chair, the fire had burned down to glowing coals. She stretched, rubbing the back of her neck, and glanced sideways at him. You always work this late, she asked. He smiled faintly. Only when there's good company. She rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth curled upward. Smooth talk for a man who nearly signed away half his land last month. He chuckled, the sound low and real. Good thing I've got a sharp-eyed partner. Partner. That word settled into her chest like a stone, but not a heavy one. A grounding one. Clara had never been anyone's partner. Not truly. She'd been a burden, a problem, a risk, an asset, but never a person who shared the weight equally. Silas wasn't offering her pity or possession. He was offering her presence, equal footing. She looked at him again, really looked, the way the firelight softened the lines in his face, the way his hands, rough and scarred, rested calmly on the table. There was no demand in him, no need to impress or prove, just a steady presence that said, I see you, I trust you, I choose you. And somehow, that meant more than any grand gesture ever could. She stood slowly, gathering the papers, and he moved to help, their hands brushing again. This time, neither of them pulled away. She turned toward the shelf to place the ledger back, and he followed, close but not crowding, just near enough to let her know he was still there. As she tucked the book away, he said quietly, Tess suits you. She turned her head slightly, eyes meeting his. Yeah, he said. It sounds like someone who's strong, who stayed, who belongs. Her throat tightened, but she forced a breath through it. Guess I'll keep it then. He nodded, and for a moment, the quiet between them said everything their words couldn't. That night, as she lay in the small bed in the corner of the house, blanket pulled to her chin, she whispered the name to herself, Tess. Not a name she had to wear like armor, but one that fit like skin. For the first time in years, she didn't dream of running. She dreamed of staying, of planting roots, of ledger pages and coffee mugs and the sound of her name spoken like it mattered, because maybe now it finally did. The morning broke pale and gray, the kind of sky that made everything feel suspended, like the world was holding its breath. Tess rose before the sun, quiet as the breeze moving through the pines. She folded her few clothes into a sack, left the ledger neatly closed on the table, and set the coffee pot out, empty but clean. Her boots didn't make a sound on the porch as she stepped down. The dirt road ahead stretching like a question with no clear answer. She didn't cry, didn't even sigh, just walked, not out of anger, not even sorrow, just a belief that maybe it was time, that maybe she had never really belonged. She had helped, yes, worked, certainly, but people like her weren't meant to stay. They were meant to pass through wild, useful, but never rooted. She made it past the cottonwoods, over the creek where the old planks moaned beneath her weight, and didn't look back. The sack over her shoulder was light, but her chest was heavy with something she couldn't quite name. She didn't leave a note. What could she have written? Thanks for letting me be useful. I didn't mean to take up so much space. Tess didn't hear the horse until well after the sun had crested the horizon. She knew the rhythm of that gait, Delilah. Silas's mare, never in a rush unless she was told to be. Tess didn't stop walking. She just slowed a little, enough to let the sound catch up. Eventually, she heard him dismount behind her, the soft thump of boots hitting the ground. She kept her eyes forward, lips pressed into a line. "You were just gonna go?" he asked, voice low, not accusing. She nodded. "Didn't think I had a place." Silas didn't answer right away. He stepped up beside her, not in front of her, not blocking the path, just there. "You built the fence that kept the calves from wandering," he said after a moment. "You organized the grain shed, found the leak in the water line, fixed the ledgers, saved the damn ranch from a con man. Hell, you planted wildflowers in dirt that hadn't seen anything but weeds in a decade." She looked at him then, slowly, her eyes wary. That was work. "Silas, that's not the same as belonging." He met her gaze. "You think belonging's about grand declarations? I'm not much for speeches. Tess, you know that. But I know what it feels like when something fits, when it makes the load lighter, when it turns a house into something closer to home." She swallowed hard, turning her face away toward the horizon. "I've never been picked, Silas. Not really. I've been sold, used, passed off, taken in for what I could do, then pushed out when I got too much. I stayed here because the work made sense, because you didn't ask for more than I could give." "I didn't ask," he said gently, "because I didn't want to put a fence around something that needed sky. But don't mistake my silence for indifference." Tess's shoulders dropped a fraction. The sack slid down her arm. "Then what am I? To you?" He didn't hesitate. "You're the person I want beside me when the roof leaks and the feed bill comes due. You're the voice I listen for when the math doesn't add up. You're the one I look for at the end of the day." She blinked, slowly. "You make it sound like partnership." He nodded. "That's exactly what it is. No promise of love, no flattery or possession, just plain truth, offered without pressure." Tess breathed in deep, the chill of the morning settling into her lungs. "You really mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. For a moment, neither moved. Then Tess let the sack fall gently to the ground. She turned to face him fully. "I don't need a ring," she said. "I don't even need words every day. But I need to know I won't be left behind when it gets hard." "You won't," he said, firm and quiet. "Not if you stay, not if you choose to." Tess looked down at her boots, scuffed and worn from the work she'd put in. Then she stepped forward. Silas reached out, not to grab, but to meet her halfway. Their hands found each other naturally, fingers weaving together like they'd done it 1,000 times. They didn't speak again as they walked back toward the ranch. The wind stirred the grass along the trail. A hawk circled high above. The creek still whispered below the planks of the bridge. Everything looked the same, but Tess felt different, lighter, anchored. When they reached the porch, she climbed the steps beside him and paused at the door. "I'd like to check the east fence line this afternoon," she said. Silas gave a small nod. "We'll do it together." She stepped inside first, and he followed, not because one was leading and the other trailing, but because they'd learned to move in rhythm, like people who'd spent enough time circling hurt to know that healing wasn't about words. It was about walking back when you could have kept going, about reaching out without being asked. No vows, no ceremony, just the soft creak of the floorboards beneath their feet and the knowledge that sometimes choosing to stay was the boldest thing a person could do. By the time the summer sun stretched long over the hills, the ranch looked like a different place. Fences stood firm and straight, no longer sagging under years of neglect. The garden by the porch was full and vibrant, wildflowers blooming in bursts of color that reached toward the sky. What had once been a patch of tired dirt was now alive, and not just with plants. There was laughter in the evenings, the smell of fresh bread in the kitchen, and the kind of steady rhythm that only came when two people shared the work without needing to be told what to do. Tess woke before dawn most mornings, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She loved the hush of the early hour, the way the world stretched awake under a sky still streaked with stars. She'd feed the chickens, check the pump, and sip coffee on the porch while the light warmed the fields. Silas joined her soon after, boots crunching quietly on the gravel as he carried the ledgers or a fresh bale of hay. They didn't need to speak much. The days were full, and they moved through them like dancers who knew the steps by heart. What once had been his land now felt like theirs, not through a signature, but through labor, sweat, and the unspoken trust that grew stronger with each task done side by side. The town began to take notice, slowly at first. The feed store clerk asked how they'd managed to get the south pasture blooming again. A neighbor 2 ridges over stopped by with questions about irrigation. And then someone no one remembered exactly who started calling the place Wildflower Ridge. The name stuck. It wasn't just for the garden, though that was part of it. It was for Tess. For the way she stood tall and unyielding, like the flowers that bloom no matter how rough the weather. It was for her spirit, fierce and rooted, for how she'd taken this place and made it grow. Silas didn't correct anyone when they called it by the new name. He just nodded, as if it had always been that way. Tess, for her part, didn't claim the title. She simply kept working. She taught the neighbor girl how to mend a saddle. She organized a harvest exchange with 3 nearby families, so she built a coop expansion by hand when the hens began laying more than expected. At night, she and Silas sat on the porch with mugs of cider, listening to the night creatures stir and the wind rustle through tall grass. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but every evening, he looked at her like he still couldn't believe she'd stayed. And every evening, she returned the look like it had never been a question. They shared everything: the books, the land, the plans. There was no need for declarations. Tess kept a ledger of expenses and repairs, and Silas added notes in the margins where he thought improvements could be made. When she brought up fencing the East Ridge, he didn't hesitate. "Let's mark it together tomorrow," he said. And they did. One afternoon, a young ranch hand passing through asked Silas if Tess was his wife. Silas paused, looked across the yard where she stood repairing a saddle strap, and answered, "She's my partner." The boy nodded, unsure of what that meant. But Silas didn't explain. He didn't need to. The land responded to their unity. Crops grew stronger. Calves were born healthy. The house, once quiet and cold, began to feel like something alive. They added shelves in the pantry for her preserves. He fixed the window latch in the bedroom so the breeze could roll in at night. She carved a wooden sign and nailed it to the front gate, Wildflower Ridge. When Silas saw it, he ran a hand over the letters, rough but carved with care, and simply said, "Looks right." It wasn't perfection. There were days when the wind tore shingles from the barn roof and nights when the well ran low. There were arguments, short and sharp, over whether to sell off the weaker heifers or invest in feed through the fall. But they always found their way back over coffee, over fence posts, over the rhythm of shared labor. That was the difference. They didn't walk away. Not anymore. Tess had started writing again in the evenings. Just small things, a list of what grew best where. A memory of a storm that once tore through her childhood. A line of thought about how wild things survive by learning what to let go. Silas didn't read them unless she left them out. But when he did, he never commented. He'd just fold the paper neatly and leave it in her drawer. A quiet acknowledgement that her thoughts mattered. By midsummer, Wildflower Ridge wasn't just a name, it was a place people respected. They came for advice, for help, for warmth they couldn't find anywhere else. And Tess, once the girl who believed she'd never stay, stood in the middle of it all like she'd been born for it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned gold, Tess leaned against the porch post, watching the wind move through the tall blooms. Silas stepped up beside her, shoulder brushing hers. "You think they'll keep calling it that?" she asked. He nodded. "They will. It fits." She turned to him, a quiet smile playing at the edge of her mouth. Not bad for two strays who had no business building a home. He chuckled. Strays make the best kind of family. Nobody expects them to stay. So when they do, it means something. They stood there for a while longer, not needing to say anything else. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped into the fading light. And in that quiet space, with dusk settling around them, Tess knew she had not just survived another season, she had arrived. Not as a guest, not as a hand, but as someone who belonged. Tess had never been the kind of woman people stayed for. All her life, folks came and went like passing storms. And she learned early not to plant roots in places where nothing seemed to grow. She'd been called too sharp, too proud, too wild to be molded into anything resembling what men wanted. And so she stopped trying. She rode the wind, followed her own rules, kept her back straight and her guard higher than any fence she ever mended. Love, she'd decided, was just another word for control, and belonging was for those lucky enough to be soft. She wasn't soft. She was flint and fire and survival carved into bone, and yet somehow, despite all that, she'd ended up here. The ranch didn't feel like a trap. It didn't feel like a hand closing around her, though it felt like sky, like space, like the first exhale after years of holding her breath. Silas never once tried to bend her into something gentler, never asked her to shrink to make him comfortable. He didn't flinch when she raised her voice or flounder when she went quiet. He treated her like someone who already belonged, even before she was ready to believe it. In the beginning, she watched him the way wild creatures do, unsure if he was friend or predator. She waited for the catch, the cost, the demand. It never came. He handed her tools and asked for her thoughts, not her obedience. He let her lead when she needed to, stepped up when she stumbled, gave her silence when words were too heavy and presence when she thought she wanted to be alone. He never made her earn the right to be seen. He simply saw her. And slowly, Tess began to see herself through his eyes, not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as something solid, capable, worthy. She planted seeds not just in the earth, but in her own heart, dangerous, delicate things like trust and hope. She laughed more, listened longer. She stopped watching the door like it might vanish. She began to stay. They never spoke in flowery terms. Their love was not painted with poetry or draped in grand confessions. It lived in the way he poured her coffee without asking, in the way she fixed the saddle he'd been meaning to get to, in the sound of two sets of boots on the porch in the morning, headed toward another day of work. It lived in shared chores, quiet glances, and the way their hands brushed without needing to hold. Tess didn't need a ring. She didn't need a last name or a paper to prove what they'd built. She needed honesty, space, and someone who wouldn't bolt when her edges showed. Silas was that someone. He never tried to own her. He simply made room for her, and in doing so, taught her how to make room for him too. By late summer, the ranch carried their rhythm like a second heartbeat. Neighbors stopped by with questions, stories, sometimes just a pie. The mailbox bore both their names scratched in careful handwriting. The wildflowers she'd planted danced in the breeze like flags of surrender, not to defeat, but to peace. Some evenings they sat on the porch, side by side in weather-worn chairs, the silence between them as rich as conversation. One night, she turned to him, out of the blue, and said, You know I'm still not easy." He didn't look surprised. "You're not meant to be." She tilted her head. "And you're okay with that." He met her eyes and said, "I didn't choose easy. I chose you." She looked away then, because sometimes that much honesty still hurt a little. But it was a good kind of hurt, like breaking open to heal better than before. She reached for his hand under the table, fingers tangling with his. No words followed. There didn't need to be any. Years from now, people would talk about the woman who turned Wildflower Ridge from a broken-down patch of land into something alive. They'd say she was fierce, that she rode like she was part of the wind and worked like she had something to prove. They'd say she couldn't be tamed, couldn't be owned, that no man ever stood a chance. And maybe that would be true. Because Tess didn't stay for someone who tried to keep her. She stayed for someone who saw her strength and never once tried to take it. Someone who stood beside her when others had only ever stood in her way. She wasn't a prize to be won. She was a partner to be chosen. And he chose her. Not once, not in a single moment of infatuation, but every morning when he rose before the sun and passed her the reins. Every evening when they shared the silence like a prayer. Every challenge they met side by side. Every flaw he didn't flinch from. And Tess chose him back, quietly, fiercely, in all the small, sacred ways that matter more than any vow. She had once believed she was the kind of woman no man could keep. And she was right, because no one kept her. Someone simply stood still long enough for her to choose staying. And when she did, it was not out of desperation, not out of need, but out of love so sure. It never asked her to be anything other than herself. The story of Tess and Silas offers a powerful reminder that it is never too late in life to choose connection over solitude, and trust over fear. For older adults who have weathered many seasons, this tale speaks to the quiet strength of mutual respect and shared purpose. Tess, once hardened by survival and betrayal, learns not only how to work the land, but how to let herself be seen and valued not for what she can offer, but for who she truly is. Silas, quiet and steady, offers her not ownership, but partnership. Together, they show that true companionship isn't built on grand gestures, but on daily acts of care, listening, and choosing each other again and again. For seniors who may feel forgotten or uncertain of their place, this story affirms that belonging doesn't fade with time, it deepens. The seeds of love, dignity, and purpose can still grow. Even after years of drought, all it takes is the courage to stay, the humility to share, and the grace to let someone walk beside you, not behind or ahead, but side by side.